There was an old custom among chroniclers in the Ironvale Hollow region. Before any account of disasters or disappearances, the same phrase was written at the top of the page: "The earth holds what man does not understand." This phrase appears repeatedly in shaky handwriting in 3 different files that mention the case of the 29 tools found without their owners in the winter of 1892. Ironvale Hollow was, at the time, a small mining community nestled between damp walls and red clay trails. The valley received little direct light. The sun was slow to overcome the Tennessee mountains, and when it finally appeared, white vapors flowed from the pine trees as if the morning itself were breathing. It was a place of long silences, measured steps, and hard work. The economy revolved around an old iron mine, exploited since 1850, which, although no longer as productive, still supported dozens of families. Among these families were the sisters Elinor and Maeve Harrow, known to the locals as the Sisters of Ironvale. Daughters of a blacksmith who had succumbed to pneumonia years earlier, they had inherited not only the simple workshop they kept near the mouth of the mine, but also a reputation for severe discipline, ritualistic devotion to work, and a way of life that bordered on asceticism. They rarely spoke more than necessary, avoided any public socializing, and maintained an almost religious distance from the community, not out of hostility, according to some later accounts, but because of rigid ancient beliefs whose origins had been lost over time. The sisters' workshop, known as Devotion Pit, was not exactly a mine, although it was part of the same iron formation. It was a kind of narrow gallery used to store tools, molds, and metal alloys. Some miners would go there to sharpen tools or pick up reinforced blades. No one ever reported anything strange about the place until the end of October 1892, just the constant smell of soot and hot iron, common in the region. The protagonist of this reconstructed account is Abel Rourke, a 38-year-old miner, born and raised in the valley. According to parish records and notes in another worker's diary, Abel was considered a disciplined man, soft-spoken and attentive. He carried the responsibility of supporting his wife and 2 children on his shoulders and rarely got involved in conflicts. He had been working in the same mine since he was 13, knew every noise of the earth and every draft that escaped through the iron cracks. It is from him and his last documented interactions that much of this investigation is based. The winter before he went missing was especially harsh. Stories from that time describe dry winds tearing across the hillsides, constant leaks rusting makeshift rails, and widespread fatigue among the miners. The Harrow sisters, as always, kept up their relentless pace of work, heating metal before dawn. Some residents claim that during that period, they saw Abel entering the devotion pit at least 3 times to adjust tools. Others say he spent too much time talking to Elinor at the workshop door, something unusual for both of them. There is no consensus, but there is repetition, and repetition in old files often points to something that does not want to be forgotten. What is known for certain from official county documents is that on November 23, 1892, 29 miners began a journey of inspection and repair in the galleries adjacent to the main mine. It was an experienced group, equipped with oil lanterns, reinforced picks, and hemp ropes. The goal was simple: to check the safety of a little explored area and adjust supports that threatened to collapse. Abel Rourke led the team. But here, in the gaps preceding the final hours of that group, begins the silence that shaped this case. A marginal note, made by Sheriff Jarvis M. Clayton in a worn notebook, records something that has never been explained. The tools came back. The men did not. That sentence, isolated in the corner of the page, marks the beginning of the mystery. Because the next morning, when the community realized the total absence of the 29 miners, they found no footprints, no signs of a struggle, nor any signs of a hasty retreat. They found only the work tools stacked inside the devotion pit, clean, organized, and too cold to have been used the night before. And it is precisely at this point that the records begin to diverge. Before disappearing from the pages of everyday life in Ironvale Hollow, the 29 miners led a routine that, although hard, was stable. The community, made up mostly of families who settled in the region around 1860, was accustomed to the constancy of underground work and the precariousness imposed by the mountains. Nothing in the general appearance of the valley suggested that an extraordinary event was approaching. People still tended their small gardens. The makeshift mine tracks squeaked with the transport of ore, and the Methodist chapel bell always rang at noon, marking an almost ritualistic break for the workers to rest. The daily life of Abel Rourke, reconstructed from the accounts of neighbors and an account book found decades later, was predictable. He woke up before sunrise, drank black coffee served by his wife Rilla, and walked to the mine in silence. He was a reserved man, but not distant. He knew the names of the children who lived in the surrounding area and had a habit of adjusting his hat before entering the galleries, as if it were a gesture of respect for the earth that could take his life at any moment. His colleagues said that Abel knew the mine's breathing, a common expression among experienced miners, referring to the cracks and drafts that precede collapses. The Harrow sisters, on the other hand, lived almost parallel to the community. The small cottage where they lived, located above the devotion pit workshop, was described as too tidy by the few visitors who had been there. Elinor, the eldest, had military discipline in the use of iron. Maeve, more silent, took care of organizing the tools and meticulously noted loans, repairs, and returns, records that, curiously, disappeared from the public archive in 1907 after a partial fire at the Sullivan County headquarters. Despite the social distance, there was a mutual dependence between the sisters and the miners. The mine required constant repairs, broken blades, worn handles, picks that needed reinforcement. The iron in the valley was not of the highest quality, but it was strong enough to sustain a precarious economy. Thus, the miners made a habit of visiting the devotion pit at least twice a week. It was in this scenario of limited but functional coexistence that the first signs, subtle, almost insignificant, emerged that something was changing within the valley. Some miners reported in later statements that the Harrow sisters seemed more tense in the weeks leading up to the final inspection. Elinor, who rarely showed emotion, reportedly refused to reinforce certain blades, insisting that they would not be necessary for that type of mining. Others mentioned that upon entering the workshop, they found the tools arranged in an unusual way, as if they had been separated for a specific and imminent use. There are also fragmented records about Abel's behavior. A longtime colleague, Silas Macomber, claimed to have seen him staring at the devotion pit for long minutes, as if trying to hear something coming from inside. According to Silas, Abel seemed torn between entering the workshop or not, a gesture that struck the valley's inhabitants as strange. Miners avoided hesitation. Every second lost meant a delay in productivity and emotional exhaustion. The climate in Ironvale Hollow in November 1892 reinforced a sense of invisible pressure. The winds were laden with fine dust, and the damp slopes caused occasional landslides. Oil lanterns flickered more frequently, and small gas explosions, common but controllable, frightened workers for 2 consecutive weeks. All of this created an atmosphere of veiled alertness, as if the earth were warning of something that no one could translate. The community, however, continued its routine. Children ran along the dirt road. Women washed clothes near the creek. The local pastor prepared his Sunday sermon on resilience and faith. The miners continued to descend into the dark tunnels with the same resignation as always. For them, danger was part of life, not a cause for suspicion, until a discrete episode occurred, recorded by only one witness, which is now considered one of the most intriguing pieces of evidence in the case. Rilla Rourke, Abel's wife, told a neighbor that her husband had been sleeping poorly for days. She said he would wake up in the middle of the night to write something down in his small leather notebook, an object that was never found among his belongings. Rilla stated that Abel repeated an almost inaudible phrase, "I think I heard wrong. I must have heard wrong." Wrong what? No one knows. Events intensified in the final week. Two tools reinforced by Elinor Harrow were returned by the miners, who claimed that they didn't fit like before. Maeve had reportedly stayed longer than necessary inside the narrow gallery where copper, raw ore, and molds were stored. A young apprentice reported that while delivering a container of oil, he noticed recent marks on the wall of the devotion pit, horizontal scratches, as if heavy boxes had been dragged from there to an unspecified location. These scattered and conflicting reports only formed a pattern years later, when historians attempted to reconstruct the timeline. At the time, they were just isolated speculations. The valley continued at its usual pace until the frosty morning of November 23, 1892, when the 29 miners, including Abel, gathered for the final inspection of the year. It was hard work, but necessary. Every year before the depths of winter, they checked the tunnels to ensure they could withstand the weight of the frozen earth. The community watched the group leave. They saw them walk through the wooden gate. They saw their lanterns disappear into the usual darkness of the mine. Nothing else seemed out of the ordinary. But the surviving documents tell a different story. That on that day, on the list of requested tools, there is a note in unknown handwriting, neither Abel's nor the sisters', marking a single word next to the devotion pit, written firmly, separated. No one knows who wrote it. No one knows what it meant. But everything indicates that from that note onwards, the following hours led to an outcome that the archives have never been able to explain. The reconstruction of the last hours of the Ironvale Hollow miners is based on fragments of testimonies, inventory notes, 2 broken lanterns found decades later, and an incomplete report by Sheriff Clayton. None of these pieces, taken alone, explains what happened on the afternoon and evening of November 23rd, 1892. But when compared, they create an almost palpable outline of what may have been the moment when the 29 workers disappeared from the community's history. According to the mine's logbook, preserved only until 1894, the group led by Abel Rourke descended into the galleries shortly after 8:30 a.m. The goal was to reach the northern section, known as the Long Gallery, where wooden supports had been damaged by water infiltration. It was an arduous journey, made with calculated steps and short conversations, as was typical among miners accustomed to the weight of darkness. Records indicate that, around 9:17 a.m., the group passed through the corridor adjacent to the devotion pit, which connected to the mine through a narrow opening used only for transporting materials. There is no evidence that they entered or stopped there, but the clues begin precisely in this absence. The miners should not have been near the workshop at that time, and yet recent drag marks, analyzed much later, suggest that some type of equipment was moved toward the main gallery. From this point on, the reconstruction becomes more sensory than factual. Historically, the Long Gallery was known for its constant cracking noises, caused by the natural compression of the rock and the circulation of air between cracks. Veteran miners, like Abel, knew how to differentiate normal noises from signs of danger, and yet statements from 2 workers who remained on the surface claim that morning, they heard a different silence coming from the depths, an expression difficult to interpret, but repeated insistently during questioning days later. The weather deteriorated rapidly. The clouds that had covered the valley since dawn began to weigh heavily on the mountains, and a fine rain fell without warning, soaking the trails, weakening the ground, and turning the air heavy and almost immobile. For those inside the mine, this meant difficulty breathing, unstable flashlights, and the need to proceed with extreme caution. Around noon, Abel reportedly sent 2 miners back to the entrance to fetch additional ropes. This detail appears in the account of an apprentice who claims to have seen both of them climb up hurriedly but confused, as if they had argued about something along the way. They never returned to the surface. Their tracks disappear a few meters from the mine exit, with no signs of a struggle, no stray footprints, no indication that they even strayed from the path. It is at this point that the case enters the realm of the inexplicable. At dusk, witnesses report hearing a single sound coming from the depths, a sharp metallic impact followed by a prolonged echo that dissipated in seconds. There was no tremor in the ground, no dust raised, no collapse recorded. Just that sound, isolated. Some residents believed it was a support breaking, others a tool falling, but no miner emerged to report what had happened. Nightfall brought an even deeper change. The rain stopped, but the valley remained overcast. Lanterns were lit around the mine entrance when the workers' return time passed without anyone showing up. Rilla Rourke, upset by her husband's delay, was reportedly the first to notice the complete absence of internal noises. No footsteps, no muffled conversation, no dragging of tools. Nothing. Just the light wind blowing through the wooden structure that supported the gate. Sheriff Clayton organized a small search party shortly after 8 p.m. They cautiously entered the mine, guided by their lanterns and the uneven tracks that led to the deeper galleries. The darkness seemed to absorb the sound of their voices, and some members of the group claimed to feel the air was denser than normal, a combination of humidity and poor circulation typical of old mines, but which, in that context, took on an unbearable psychological weight. Upon reaching the entrance to the long gallery, they found the first concrete clue that would survive the following years. A set of tools neatly stacked next to a rock, all clean, all perfectly aligned, as if someone had removed the soot from each one at that very moment. This organization was the opposite of what one would expect in an emergency situation. Under normal conditions, miners leave tools where they are, never stacking objects while in danger. But what caught the sheriff's men's attention most was not the tools, but the complete absence of footprints around them. The floor, although damp, was intact, a carpet of smooth earth with no human marks. As they advanced through the gallery, they found a second set of lanterns, 3 of them, left on the floor, lying on their sides, as if they had been dropped at the end of a conversation or at the beginning of an interrupted gesture. The oil was still warm, indicating that they had been used a few hours earlier, but there were no miners around, no noise, no trace. The moment of greatest tension came when the team reached the corridor, connecting the long gallery to the devotion pit. The light from the lanterns revealed recent marks on the walls, horizontal and vertical scratches, similar to those observed by an apprentice days earlier, but much more extensive. They seemed to indicate that heavy boxes had been moved from there, although no one could say where to. And then, on the border between the workshop and the gallery, they found something that Sheriff Clayton described as too disturbing to make sense. All the tools requested by the 29 miners that day were stacked inside the devotion pit in exactly the same order as they appeared on the list signed by Abel, but clean, polished, and completely dry, despite the extreme humidity of the environment. The workshop, which normally smelled of hot metal and burnt oil, was cold, freezing cold. The kind of cold that doesn't come from the temperature but from the silence. The Harrow sisters were sought out immediately. Elinor and Maeve were in the cottage, wearing work clothes and with clean hands, which was rare for those who spent their days handling iron. They claimed not to have seen the miners after the morning and said they had not entered the workshop since the beginning of the day. Their statements, recorded in Clayton's notebook, are too short, almost symbolic, as if they were answering the bare minimum. The last known evidence emerges at this point, an almost unnoticed detail, but one that historians consider crucial. Among the stacked tools, there was a single piece of paper stuck under the handle of a sledgehammer. The handwriting was irregular, hurried. The paper was partially crumpled, but legible enough to reveal 4 words. "Don't come in here anymore." No signature, no explanation, no clue as to who wrote it. It was as if that note was the only remaining voice of 29 men who hours earlier had walked alive through the mine. And after that, only silence. The news of the disappearance of the 29 miners spread through Ironvale Hollow like a cold wind that no one expected. The valley, which lived by quiet and predictable routines, came to a standstill. Women rushed to the mine entrance, some carrying lanterns, others just despair in their eyes. Children were kept indoors, and the dogs, usually restless, remained strangely quiet throughout the night. The chapel bell, traditionally used to announce serious accidents, rang 3 times, but this time it sounded more like a cry for help than a confirmation of tragedy. Sheriff Clayton, pressured by the community, organized search teams for 3 consecutive days. They entered and exited the mine in shifts, examining every corridor, every crevice, every space where a miner could have taken refuge. Nothing. Not a piece of fabric. No signs of a fall. No signs of collapse. Just the same scene repeated. Stacked tools, unlit lanterns and scraped walls, indicating recent movement of boxes or structures. The Harrow sisters were summoned again to testify. They sat before the sheriff without hesitation. Elinor kept her gaze fixed on a point on the wall, and Maeve held her hands in her lap, her fingers intertwined so tightly that her knuckles turned white. They stated that they had only been in the workshop in the early hours of the morning and had not seen anyone return. When asked about the clean and stacked tools, Elinor replied coldly, "If they were left like that, it wasn't us who left them." There was no way to prove otherwise. As the days passed, rumors began to form, as is almost always the case when the truth is unclear. Some claimed that the miners had found an unknown passage and got lost in the depths. Others suggested that toxic gases had spread silently, causing them to retreat toward the devotion pit, where, for reasons beyond comprehension, they would have organized their tools before succumbing. There were also those who blamed the valley itself, saying that the mountains close what they no longer want to give back, an ancient metaphor to explain unexplained tragedies. But 2 testimonies, preserved on torn sheets of paper, gained importance among historians. The first came from Silas Macomber, who had worked with Abel for over 20 years. In a conversation recorded by the local pastor, Silas states that, days before the disappearance, Abel seemed disturbed by something he had heard in the workshop. He did not describe exactly what it was. He only said that it sounded like a muffled request, as if the iron had a memory. Silas acknowledged that he may have misinterpreted Abel's words, and that the tension of the previous weeks may have distorted his memories. Still, he noted, he seemed afraid to go in there again. The second statement came from Abel Rourke, Abel's widow. In her statement to the sheriff, she said that her husband had been waking up in the middle of the night, writing short sentences in a notebook. She said that, on the last night before the inspection, Abel had repeated a sentence that she did not fully understand, but that sounded like a silent concern. "If it's right, I shouldn't take anyone there." The notebook, as already mentioned, was never found among the family's belongings. These fragments, although subtle, raised a hypothesis later accepted by some researchers: the possibility that the miners had discovered, during previous inspections, an unstable area at risk of collapse or explosion, and that Abel was trying to keep the group away from a dangerous section. The mysterious note separated, made on the list of tools, may have indicated that certain instruments should not be used or that a specific area should be isolated. The most human, and perhaps the most painful, revelation comes precisely when the documents analyzed show that the devotion pit was in critical structural condition, something that would only become evident decades later, when detailed geological studies were carried out in the region. According to these reports, the workshop had been built on a stress cavity, an area where rock layers were under uneven pressure, creating small pockets of instability. Any strong impact, a gas explosion, the collapse of a support, the movement of heavy boxes, could trigger a sudden displacement of Earth. Most likely, according to this theory, the miners were not caught up in something inexplicable, but rather something too quiet to be noticed. An internal collapse without significant noise, a sudden suction caused by accumulated pressure. In this scenario, the stacked tools, clean and tidy, may reflect the last human effort before the tragedy. Miners trying to organize what they had finished using, preparing to leave the workshop or gallery. Or perhaps the gesture was part of an attempt at a coordinated evacuation, abruptly interrupted. The note found under the sledgehammer then takes on new significance. Don't come in here anymore. Not a threat, not an obscure warning, but a last desperate alert from someone who understood the risk seconds before the inevitable. For many in the valley, this explanation brought some comfort. For others, it changed nothing. The absence of bodies, of noises, of any sign of resistance still seemed too great to be attributed to a silent collapse. Still, This was the version that stabilized over time. The miners were victims of an invisible geological fault, so sudden and complete that it left no trace. The valley buried names without real burials. The chapel erected a wooden plaque with the names of the 29 missing persons. The devotion pit was sealed days later, by order of the sheriff. The Harrow sisters left Ironvale Hollow in 1894 and were never seen in the region again. And even the most plausible revelation did not erase what remained suspended in the archives. The feeling that, on that night, the valley witnessed something it did not know how to record. Decades later, when Ironvale Hollow no longer had the same industrial strength and the mine was reduced to moss-covered ruins, few clearly remembered the disappearance of the 29 miners. Subsequent generations grew up hearing about the case as if it were a shadow that hung only over the families who lost their men. But for a researcher who walks among archives, time does not erase, it only reorganizes. It was in this condition that I came across the fragmented documents of this case. There was no continuous narrative, only pieces of lives stitched together by different hands. Sheriff Clayton's firm handwriting, the silent despair of the widow's testimonies, the incomplete mine reports, the pastor's worn notes, the scribbled margins of an inventory notebook signed by Maeve Harrow. The past, I realized, is not a story. It is someone's effort to piece together what has survived. As I reread everything one last time, I tried to imagine the valley as it was in 1892. The fog clinging to the pine trees, the slopes heavy after the rain, the smell of heated metal escaping from the sisters' workshop, the hollow sound of hammers against ore. I tried to imagine Abel Rourke walking to the mine on that final morning, his hat adjusted at the exact angle as always, repeating to himself some concern he could never explain. And above all, I tried to understand the abrupt silence that replaced 29 voices in a matter of hours. What remains, after all this time, is not the disappearance itself, but the way the community dealt with it. Each person, in their own way, tried to fill the void left by the miners. The pastor turned the absence into a sermon. The widows turned it into a vigil. The children turned it into stories whispered by the creek. And some historians turned the case into an attempt at explanation, even though they knew that certain facts resist clarity. The devotion pit, for its part, is a chapter apart. Today, the site is just a space taken over by roots and loose stones. But when I visited its ruins, I noticed something that doesn't appear in the reports. A sense of interruption. Not fear, not superstition, just the impression that the work there was interrupted with a haste that does not usually belong to humans accustomed to danger. The workshop, sealed shortly after the disappearance, retains a mystery that is not supernatural, but human. The mystery of decisions made in seconds, of interrupted gestures, of warnings left too late. The note found under the sledgehammer was preserved by the county until 1931, when it finally deteriorated completely. Its transcription, however, survives. Do not enter here anymore. Some claim it was written by Abel, others by an anonymous miner. There are those who say it was the work of someone who tried to prevent more men from being swallowed up by an unstable area of the mine. The paper never answered, but its existence, as small as a hasty warning can be, became the clearest voice in the entire case. When I reflect on this, I realize that perhaps this is the true revelation hidden between the ancient pages. The disappearance was not just a geological event, nor an accident impossible to explain. Rather, it was the sum of small ignored signs, unshared fears, decisions made on the border between duty and doubt. The tragedy did not begin in the mine, but days before, in the phrases Abel muttered at night, in the tools that no longer fit as before, in the Harrow sisters avoiding questions they did not want to answer. A tragedy is often the accumulation of silences. Time, however, is generous and cruel in equal measure. It softens the edges of suffering, but deepens what has never been resolved. Today, the case of the Ironvale Hollow miners is remembered as a historical scar, visible but untouchable, present but irretrievable. And perhaps this is because certain questions remain unanswered, not for lack of evidence, but because they were asked too late. As I close this dossier, I leave a record of the final impression I had when revisiting each of these documents. No matter how many years pass, there are stories that remain unfinished, not because of their complexity, but because of their humanity. The disappearance of the 29 miners from Ironvale was not a gesture of nature against men, nor a secret buried by the mountains. It was, above all, the echo of lives interrupted in full swing, lives that worked, feared, loved, and hoped to return home at the end of another ordinary day. But they did not return, and the last truth that remains is the quietest of all. The valley never returned anything it took that night.